philosophy of money. We don't talk about that because for the last 100 years, we've just naturally assumed money is the dollar.
All of these three places are ways that authoritarians can exert control. They can manipulate the money supply, or they can confiscate funds that are in an account that you purportedly own.
You get the opportunity to step into a world, A, government currencies that are pure fiat, backed by nothing but the trust of the government, or B, currencies that are backed by hard assets, such as gold or Bitcoin. Is that a thought exercise we can play here? Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Proof of Words. Today, we are joined by a guest that I'm very particularly interested to interview. It is Brad Rettler, an author of Resistance Money, a book that is currently in pre-order. Brad, maybe if you would be so kind as to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your journey into Bitcoin, and I definitely would love to hear the kind of high-level executive summary of Resistance Money, your book that's upcoming.
Sure. So I am a philosophy professor at the University of Wyoming, and my interest in Bitcoin originally had absolutely nothing to do with my interest in philosophy. I found out about it as a graduate student, and one of the guys who was a year ahead of me in the program came back from a summer break, and he was the kind of guy that bothered everyone all the time to talking about whatever he wanted to talk about, which was usually some philosophical topic. But this time he came back and all he wanted to talk about was Bitcoin. So we'd go out to the bars.
It sounds like me at my family Thanksgiving dinner.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we'd all go out to the bars together, and he would just, whoever was around him, he was talking about Bitcoin. And I grew up in Singapore for a couple of years. And my first thought when hearing about this sort of internet-based currency with the blockchain and the public ledger was that it seemed ideally suited for international remittances. And I recalled standing at the malls in Singapore watching the foreign workers send money back home. And they were paying at the time, 8 to 12%. And someone in the country that they're sending it to has to walk however far to get there. And then they have to walk home with cash, and then they have to store the cash somehow. And I just thought, this is going to revolutionize international remittances. So I had no idea about the supply cap, about nodes, about miners, about energy, any of that stuff. I just thought, a new thing for international
that's one of the
remittances.
primary reasons El Salvador adopted it as a currency, right? I mean, you have an ungodly amount of El Salvadorans living in the United States that have always used Western Union sending money back, right? I mean, people talk about this being a really political thing, but actually for El Salvador, it was practical. It made it infinitely cheaper for El Salvadorians living in America, living abroad, which I think it's something like 40% of the male population of El Salvador. And they're all sending money back to their families, and Bitcoin just makes it easier, right?
Yeah, exactly. There are countries for whom an appreciable fraction of their GDP is foreign remittances. And so by switching to Bitcoin, you can appreciably increase the GDP of countries, perhaps double-digit percentages, depending on which country and how much of it switches over to Bitcoin. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense for the countries themselves.
No, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about resistance money, a philosophical case for Bitcoin. I mean, I always find it's funny. I end up always having people on this show. I mean, either they come from like either institutional finance or something like that, because that's more my background, and that's how I ended up discovering blockchain and then Bitcoin. I've had a couple of engineers, like electrical engineers, mechanical engineers on this show, because there's the overlap between Bitcoin and energy production and mining, right? Can't say I've had a philosopher so far. So maybe we can start with, I mean, how did you go from being a philosopher, what was it about Bitcoin that spoke to you after your friends started telling you about it?
Well, happy to be the first philosopher. There are four of us. So,
I know, I already feel smarter.
The interesting issues with Bitcoin, I think, are spread out across tons of different, at least academic areas. So you have, of course, computer science, law, political science, engineering, and I'm sure there are many others that I'm blanking on right now. But philosophy is kind of a discipline that bundles things. So you have philosophy of law, you have philosophy of computing, you have philosophy of pretty much anything you can add at the end of that.
I mean, philosophy of money, right? We don't talk about we don't talk about that because for the last 100 years, we've just naturally assumed money is the dollar. Well, turns out that's not really
Yeah,
the case,
we
right?
have a lot of assumptions, and philosophy also allows us to question any of our assumptions that we want. And we can use data from all different kinds of fields. We can use empirical data, and we can also use sort of theoretical data that we get from reflection. Do I think things should be this way? And so when I started thinking about the interesting features of Bitcoin, I was thinking about things like privacy, about sort of a monetary policy that couldn't be changed. And the interesting questions there, I think, are normative questions. Should we have financial privacy? Should we be entitled to keep some of the financial facts about us to ourselves, or to selectively disclose them? I think Eric Hughes said privacy is not secrecy. Privacy is being able to selectively disclose facts to the world. And so those are properly philosophical questions. We should evaluate the pros and cons of privacy. It allows bad things. It also allows good things. And how do we balance these?
So it's almost as though it's more of a permissioned based system. Like you shouldn't be forced to disclose things, but rather have the opportunity to opt in to a certain extent. Yeah.
That the facts about you should be up to you who learns about them. And so in the book, we started writing about privacy, about censorship resistance, and about financial inclusion. And then we thought we really have to talk about energy, because everyone's talking about energy. And of course, there's a lot of empirical stuff that goes into a discussion of Bitcoin's energy use, but there's also some sort of normative theoretical things, like how do we weigh, suppose Bitcoin is contributing a lot of CO2 to the atmosphere. How do we weigh that against the goods that it's doing for people who are resisting authoritarianism, for people who are financially excluded? Purely climate science can't tell you that. It can't weigh those things for you. That's the job of philosophers. So then we hit upon this old thought experiment in philosophy it was originally an economist, John Harsanyi, but then John Rawls made it much more popular, called the veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance says, take away everything you know about who you are in the world. So keep all your knowledge of the actual world and what it's like and which people are wealthy and how they got wealthy and how governments work and everything, but forget which one of the people you are. So you know all the facts about all the people, but you don't know which one is you. Then you could be anyone. Okay.
I'm actually going to try this thought experiment now. So let's keep going.
So you know everything about the whole world. You know that you know that Brad and Pat are having this conversation, but you don't know which one of us you are, or if you're even one of us. You could be anyone in the world. And then you're going to step back into the world from behind the veil. And you have two choices. You could step into a world with Bitcoin, or you could step into a world without Bitcoin. Which world would you choose if you didn't know who you'd be? And our thought is
if you didn't know who you would be.
Yeah, so you're taking a gamble. Which person am I gonna be when I step back into the world? Now, maybe I'm gonna be Michael Saylor. I definitely want to step back into the Bitcoin world, because what's Michael Saylor gonna have now? You have to change some local things, right? He's not gonna be all his Bitcoin wealth isn't gonna have vanished. It's gonna have been in something else instead. But still, Michael Saylor is much better off in the Bitcoin world than in the non-Bitcoin world. Maybe I'm good.
Yeah, but what if you step into this and you're Elizabeth Warren?
Yeah, you might be.
Bitcoin's destroying her career.
Yeah, so if Elizabeth Warren didn't have Bitcoin to fight against, she'd be fighting against something else, probably based on her career, something much more reasonable to fight against, like some sort of banking overreach or something. So if you're Elizabeth Warren, you definitely want to step back into the no Bitcoin world. But you have an equal chance of being them or anyone else. So we got to take all 8 billion people in the world and figure out for each of them, is Bitcoin better or worse for them? Then we also have to figure out how much better or how much worse is it for these people? Because you not only have this expected utility sort of calculus, who's better off and who's worse off, but also a risk attitude. How willing am I to take a risky bet? For some people in the world, if you take Bitcoin away from them, they'll die because they can't buy food, or they can't buy things. The government that they live under is going to find out where they live because they have to use other means, and they'll get killed.
Mm-hmm.
So if you step back into the non-Bitcoin world and you're one of those people, you're in big trouble. Is there anyone in the Bitcoin world who's being harmed to that extent? Probably not. There are people who live next door to mining facilities that are very loud, and it's decreasing their quality of life, but it's not killing them. Are there people who Bitcoin is killing? If there are, I don't know about them. And there might be some downstream effects of various miners that have that feature, but I don't know about them if so. So how willing are you to take this risky bet? And so we go through each of these things: privacy, censorship resistance, financial inclusion, energy. And we talk about what you decide if you didn't know who in the world you were, if you didn't know which country you were living in and what position you occupied. And we think it's pretty clear by the end that anyone who's reading the book would want to...
Whoa, spoiler alert.
I mean, the subtitle tells you it's a philosophical case for Bitcoin. So we think it's pretty clear that if you didn't know who you'd be, you'd want to accept Bitcoin. Now you step back into the world and you do know who you are, and maybe you're someone that Bitcoin is not helping. Then what should your attitude be, given that you've gone through this thought experiment with us? Well, our thought is hopefully you're a good person and you care about people other than yourself. And so you should stop being opposed to Bitcoin. You should realize who Bitcoin is helping and recognize that even though those people aren't you, they're still people, and they're still valuable, and they're still worth fighting for and giving a financial lifeline to. And so we conclude with some ways that people can support the Bitcoin network and help it be resistance money.
Well, that assumes that Bitcoin's not directly harming you, right? Because like if you're neutral, you don't have Bitcoin doesn't impact you positively or negatively, then yeah, the natural assumption would be a person who's not completely self-absorbed and selfish would say, yeah, it's a net good for other people, therefore it's a good thing. But what if you're one of the, and this comes back to the question, I mean, who are the ones that are actually ever hurt by Bitcoin? And it seems as though the only people that are ever hurt by Bitcoin over a long term, I mean, if you're stupid enough to buy in at the top and then sell a few months later because you didn't have the long-term vision of what Bitcoin is, yeah, you're temporarily financially hurt, but you frankly did it to yourself. Long-term, you would have ended up in the money anyway. But taking away any of the financial aspect of it, the only people that seemingly are ever hurt by Bitcoin are the ones that are directly trying to oppose it. And that's where I think if you just play game theory, right? Another philosophical, economic concept, but a philosophical concept. The only conclusion you can arrive is that the Nash equilibrium is you have to embrace and adopt Bitcoin. If you oppose it, you're the only people that ever get hurt by it. And that's the Elizabeth Warrens, that's some of the banks. I mean, the Biden administration right now is reeling because Trump has now come out as a huge Bitcoiner, I guess. And it's becoming, yeah. Well, I don't think he really is. At the end of the day,
I'm very skeptical.
I think he realizes it's good politically
right now,
for him,
at least.
Yeah. And it really kind of exactly, and it kind of poo-poos a little bit on the left, right? Especially with Warren being the lead driver behind this stuff. So he's in it for himself. That's who Donald Trump is. It is what it is. But at the end of the day, it really does seem like it's only the people that oppose Bitcoin ever actually get hurt by it.
Yeah, I think the people that I first thought of were people critical of Bitcoin. And other than Elizabeth Warren, who relies on votes, namely Democratic votes, who tend to be young and people of color who own Bitcoin at higher rates than old people and white people.
Right.
So huge political mistake there. I'm not sure how much worse off she is, even if she doesn't get reelected. She's going to be fine. Right. So crypto critics, Bitcoin critics, if Bitcoin didn't exist, would they be as well off? I'm not sure what they'd be talking about or what kind of audience they'd have. So maybe they're even better off with Bitcoin continuing to exist. There are a lot of people who...
Oh, I'm 100% convinced that Peter Schiff, for instance, he might not own Bitcoin, but he would have nowhere near the notoriety that he does if he wasn't so, at least publicly, staunchly against Bitcoin, right? I mean, Bitcoin really, it didn't make his empire, but Bitcoin certainly helped take his empire to the next level, right? Even Nouriel Roubini to a certain extent by being so outspoken as an academic against Bitcoin. It certainly elevated his position
Yeah,
globally.
definitely. So really the people who are harmed, I think people who are harmed by Bitcoin are people who have bought more than they could afford to buy and then sold when they had to. And this might have been people who were forced to do that because they were, I mean, imagine you're in a country in 2019, December of 2017, and your currency is collapsing and you get into Bitcoin at 19,000 US dollars.
Yeah.
And then a few months later, it's down to 3,000 through no fault of your own, right? You took what you thought was an exit from your country's currency and now you're screwed. So I have a lot of sympathy for that. And I wish that hadn't happened. And I don't know that there's anything that could be done about that. I'm not sure there was any better options for at least some of those people who don't have access to US dollars. So the other thing I think of is people who...
Well, that's why Tether's also picked up in Steam recently too, right? A lot of people are now using Tether for remittances because, okay, at the end of the day, it's backed by fiat currency. It's backed by a basket of assets. It's backed by treasuries, right? We now have the Tether audits that kind of show this, or at least the Tether statements that show this. For a lot of these people, they go, okay, Bitcoin might be too volatile. And even though Tether is backed by fiat, fiat is effectively worthless, at least in my personal view. But for these people, that volatility of Bitcoin is too much to stomach for exactly what you just said. And even though Tether inflates in parallel of the US dollar, it's infinitely better than the inflation or devaluation of the currencies of the local domiciles.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. And I'm going to trust those people to make the best decision given their circumstances. And it's good, I think, that they have access to Bitcoin and that they have access to things like Tether, which are still, I think, better than owning physical US dollars, especially if you're going to try to escape from a country.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's great. So the one thing I'd say about people who are actively harmed by Bitcoin is unless you're being harmed to the point of death, you maybe should still support Bitcoin because you realize that without it, some people will die. And you could maybe consider yourself enduring some harms in order to prevent much greater harms to other people. I, for example, pay taxes. And I'm happy to do that because it funds the school system around me. And I think it's in the end good that the children around me are getting educated, especially the children whose parents couldn't afford to send them to school if they had to pay for it. So similar, with other government services, I'm willing to endure small harms for the sake of preventing much greater harms. And there, I think in the end, it will end up being better for me too. And I think that might be the case here too. If Bitcoin continues to exist and continues to get better, that will make the world a better place to be in. There will be fewer authoritarian governments because they won't be able to control the money supply. There will be fewer wars because they'll be more costly. And that will be good for everyone.
So now that we've had that kind of more philosophical view of Bitcoin, I mean, how is it that you fundamentally view Bitcoin at the end of the day? Because I'm like a lot of the topics that are coming in your books is about resisting authoritarianism. I'm guessing a hedge against inflation, censorship-resistant money. So what is Bitcoin, therefore, to you as that philosopher? Outside of just being a net good, which it seems like where your book arrives.
Yeah, I think of Bitcoin as a tool to resist the overreach of corporations and governments. And even if it doesn't take over, say, as the only money, it still serves as a competitive check. So I don't think about Bitcoin necessarily as inflation resistance, but I think about it as maybe you could call it like ruler resistant or something. So Bitcoin doesn't have rulers. There's no rulers at the level of monetary policy, nor at the level of managing your money. You're not trusting a bank to hold it for you, nor as a mediator. There's no go-between when you're transacting. And all of these three places are ways that authoritarians can exert control. They can manipulate the money supply. They can bar some people from transacting at all, or they can confiscate funds that are in an account that you purportedly own. So by getting rid of these things, Bitcoin is resistant to people who are trying to meddle with money. And the fact that that exists, I think, helps to guard against too much of that stuff in other currencies. Right? So if the US makes a CBDC that we know isn't private, then, and people have the option of using Bitcoin instead, they're going to use Bitcoin. So it might be that the existence of Bitcoin makes an eventual US CBDC more provably private.
So it's almost a bit, I mean, I always say Bitcoin, I mean, I have my view of what Bitcoin can be. I think it should be the, and that's a much longer conversation, but I think it should be the de facto global settlement layer for all of financial commerce around the world. But if you look at it as pure e-money, which it effectively is today, peer-to-peer, censorship-resistant e-cash, but as a alternative, which I think is what it is more better described. I mean, you have a whole bunch of Bitcoiners that look at this and say it's going to replace the dollar. It's going to become the global standard of money, the global reserve currency. And maybe it will. I don't know. I actually think it's more likely Bitcoin starts to get used to back other currencies, maybe CBDCs to an extent. But I still think it'll always be dollars, euros, etc., or at least that'll be the denomination. But Bitcoin is kind of an accountability check to make sure that that wild government overreach that could be implemented through CBDCs never truly comes to fruition.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The fact that Bitcoin exists alongside these things, and that money makers and managers and mediators know that Bitcoin exists and that Bitcoin is incorruptible in these three areas, will, I think, cause them to make different decisions about their own currencies than they might otherwise have done.
No, I would entirely agree with that. I mean, I ponder what would happen in a world where Bitcoin becomes a part of a basket of goods, a basket of assets that end up backing and supporting what we currently perceive as fiat currencies. I mean, is there like any philosophical game you play as to what would happen in that type of a world? Maybe put it like this. Let's go back to your, what did you call it before? The veil of ignorance. Yeah. You get the opportunity to step into a world either with, so let's assume it's government currencies. It has to be government issued currencies because that's the world we currently live in, right? You have to step into a world of A, government currencies that are pure fiat, backed by nothing but the trust of the government, or B, currencies that are backed by hard, tangible assets, whether they exist fundamentally in the real physical world, such as gold, which is the gold standard we used to have, or digital assets such as Bitcoin. I don't know. Is that a thought exercise?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So I guess I'd wonder a few things. One is there some fixed ratio of the backing instrument to the currency that's being issued? Because the U.S. government still owns gold, and it's in some sense backing part of the currency. It's just that if you did a ratio of dollars to gold, it would be much less than it used to be.
Well, I think the difference is it used to be that there was this fixed and standard amount of gold that you could redeem dollars for. And that's no longer the case. Interestingly, Russia went back to that. You can now redeem rubles for gold in Russia. I'm not sure exactly how that works.
Is that merely theoretical, or are people actually doing that? I wonder.
So I don't know, because, like, for instance, here in Germany, we have a gold-backed ETP. But it's not like a gold ETF, because the gold ETFs you have in the United States, they're not backed by physical gold. They're backed by the rights to a gold remittance. It's basically gold futures contracts, if you want to put it like that, right? The same with crude. Whenever you buy into a crude ETF in America, you're not actually buying a asset that you can redeem for crude oil. I mean, who the hell would want to do that? You're buying an asset that is basically trading in crude futures, which is why a few years ago, you remember when oil tanked and the ETFs actually went to like negative value? The ETFs were less than $1 because the barrel of oil tanked like in a short-term period. Anyways, In Europe, we actually have, for instance, Satra Gold. It's an ETP, so similar to an ETF. It's just the European version of it, backed by gold. And you can actually redeem it physically for gold. So you can actually just go to Satra. It's run by the Deutsche Börse. Say, hey, Mr. Satra, I'd like a bar of gold. Here's my ETP. They're required by law to exchange it, but I actually had a friend of mine that went through the process of doing it. It literally took him like 2 years to get his goddamn bar of gold and the conclusion there was maybe there's not exactly as much gold backing these products as we expect, because it should not have taken that long. But lo and behold, he ended up having like a certain kilogram of gold delivered to his goddamn doorstep. It was hilarious.
That's amazing. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess one worry about it is the more Bitcoin that governments use, the less, or that governments own, the less there is to go around to other people. Now, maybe you think, well, if the government owns it and then they're issuing a currency that's backed by it, then the people have it sort of derivatively. But one of the cool things about Bitcoin is that you don't have to have it derivatively. You can self-custody, and that is better than having it in some ETF or having it through a government or something like that. On the other hand, if it was governments that have had traditionally unstable currencies where people don't like to hold those currencies, then it seems like a really good thing. So I was just reading now. I can't remember what country it is, but there's some country in, I think, Southeast Asia that has a whole lot of Bitcoin that they seized from a criminal enterprise. That's an appreciable.
Maybe, but I think the most famous one is no, it's not Belarus.
Bulgaria.
Bulgaria.
Is that it?
There was, yeah.
Okay, so
yeah,
not Southeast Asia.
That's in Southeast Europe. No, that's Southeast Europe. But there was one point in time where only Satoshi owned more Bitcoin than the government of Bulgaria.
Yes, so they have like 200,000 Bitcoin. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think that's just today. I think before it was like 500,000 or 600,000. Like, it was wild how much Bitcoin they had. And then the FBI ended up having a little bit more. Then Block One had more, and now it's Michael Saylor, I think, is number 2 behind Satoshi.
Yeah. So countries like that who have Bitcoin, I think, would engender more confidence in the use of their own currency, whether or not there's a fixed ratio of redemption or something like that. But just knowing that my government, who has debts that aren't denominated in its own currency and things like that, has this asset that's backing its currency, and it can pay its debts in Bitcoin and things like that. So I guess
But we've had a little bit of an experiment like that, even natively in crypto before, right? I mean, let's look at Terra Luna. Luna was partially backed by Bitcoin. I think Do Kwon ended up acquiring well over a couple billion in Bitcoin to back Terra Luna. Now, at the end of the day, it wasn't like Luna was not anything that was ever fundamentally backed by anything besides its algo, which printed new Luna based on necessary redemptions and for its stablecoin, and Bitcoin itself. And whenever the algo ended up printing too much of the stablecoin to support it, the redemptions just didn't work. They had to start liquidating the Bitcoin. And wouldn't you know it, it all came down and collapsed because it didn't have the trust layer that a theoretical government does. But at the end of the day, fundamentally, that doesn't work much different, in my view, than a Bitcoin-backed fiat currency.
Because you could just print
So you could basically say that a Bitcoin-backed dollar looks no different than Terra Luna, which was a Ponzi. It was a scam.
Yeah, there's still these lingering questions about whether had the algorithm worked slightly differently, or had people not gotten worried, or had there been something else backing it as well. But yeah, I think I agree with you that just having the backing isn't enough to ensure that the thing isn't going to fail at some point. So then I still think I like it better for countries that aren't like the US or the UK or Germany or something. But I'd much rather the people have it instead of the governments. So, I mean, my goal is for the people who need to use it for resistance money to get it first, and then the governments of those countries, and then, far down the line, things like the U.S. government.
So, I mean, one of the things that people always ask about Bitcoin, because there's this misconception that just because it is, I mean, it's theoretically anonymous, but I always say that it really isn't. It's pseudo-anonymous, right? You can track wallet behaviors, and you're basically able to determine who, we know who owns certain wallets, right? Like, even before they started making it publicly available, we all knew who the Binance wallets were. We knew the Bitfinex wallets, et cetera, et cetera. And luckily, these organizations have publicly disclosed that. But even on the microtransaction level, you can track wallet behavior such that did Bitcoin itself not potentially, and the cypherpunks, Satoshi, whoever he may have been, did they not potentially fundamentally create the technology of the downfall of privacy? Because that's a conversation that I always like to have. And many people have very different views on it, because a lot of people will say, yeah, you know what, even though Bitcoin is this completely transparent ledger, it's still anonymous. It's not, though. It really just fundamentally isn't. Now, on the other side, I look at this and say, well, the cypherpunks that wanted privacy through Bitcoin, the cypherpunks that wanted transparency through Bitcoin, they ended up just creating something that governments are now going to completely bastardize, and it'll be the death of financial privacy.
Yeah, I think that, at least in the book, the most challenging aspect that we talk about is privacy. At least that's where we say it. Mm-hmm. Bitcoin hasn't made good on at least some of the original promises. So if you wanted a completely anonymous digital cash, you don't have that with Bitcoin. If you wanted digital cash that had similar privacy to physical cash, then I actually think Bitcoin is pretty close to that. Physical cash, you can still monitor the spending of. You just have to have physical eyes on transactions. There has to be an exchanging of some paper notes. And if you can get in the room while that's happening, you can know how much was going, who it was going from, who it was going to. So now,
and all those stores have closed circuit cameras for security. So you know who's transacting in US dollars.
If you can hack into some of these cameras, then you don't even have to be there. So in that respect, Bitcoin has actually really similar privacy to physical cash, which is that it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And then there are a variety of privacy enhancing tools that you can use that make for more privacy, things like CoinJoin or things like Lightning. And so our suspicion in the book is that people who don't need that much privacy will be just fine transacting in Bitcoin using KYC exchanges and trusting that the government or corporations or whatever are not going to spend the resources necessary to track their Bitcoin purchases, because it is more intensive than using Visa or MasterCard or something. But the people who...
Oh, now I know what my next question is. Can we trust the government to do that?
I think we could trust the government to do what's in its best interest, which is not going to be to allocate resources to monitor my Bitcoin spending. Michael Saylor might be a different story. So Michael Saylor, because of how much Bitcoin he has and maybe how much he's spending, might want to use more privacy devices on Bitcoin than someone like me. And certainly people who are trying to buy gas masks or other sort of protest adjacent physical goods with Bitcoin need to be even more careful. Yeah. And now a lot of those people are going to be living under governments that aren't going to have the same sort of resources to track Bitcoin activity as my government does.
That's fair.
So in the end, I think Bitcoin is pretty good on privacy, but could be better. One big problem, I'll add one last thing, and then one big problem is that you could do something now that compromises, the last 10 years of your Bitcoin activity. If you somehow associate an address with your name, then people can go back and see how stuff moved. And so you could have been doing perfectly for 10 years and then undo all of that with one transaction now. So the backward-looking privacy is a really big problem.
It absolutely is. But I mean, that's where you end up having, it's not on Bitcoin, but like tornado cash, right? Basically a way to wash your assets such that it cannot really be tracked anymore. And that leads me to my next question is, should from that philosophical perspective, should financial transactions be completely private? Or is there a net good either from a public perspective, each of us knowing where our respective members of society stand from a financial standpoint, like what they're purchasing, what they're buying, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a good from a governmental standpoint, or is it actually a negative? Because I don't want my neighbors to know what I'm purchasing, and I don't want the government to know everything about my assets.
Yeah, I think that we always have treated privacy as a fundamental right and a defeasible good. So something that's good but isn't always good. So there might be particular people who we don't think should be allowed to privately transact. But for the vast majority of people who haven't done things to undermine their rights to that, it should be granted until that point. So I think that.
But this is where the conversation that we have there, I think, inevitably runs down into an issue of governance, because to a certain extent, I think I agree with you. Like, if we assume now, like, I'm on the side of taxation is theft at this point, but let's assume we live in a world where taxation is a necessity, which it kind of is right now, or at least I can't really foresee a world without taxation. So we live in this world with taxation, and the government then has a responsibility. It actually does in that world have a fiduciary duty to know what individual income levels are, what capital gains are, what business revenue, gross profit, net profits are, because it has that fiduciary duty to its citizens in that world, again, where taxation has to exist, where I don't think it should. But it has that responsibility that it has to know that, because it has to know what it has to take from these entities in taxes. Now, that poses the issue. Well, now every financial transaction effectively has to be disclosed. And I mean, I'm a CPA by trade. I used to be an auditor. So I had to train a little bit in taxation. I didn't really go down the full rabbit hole, but I had to pass a test on it. I mean, a lot of people don't know that it's not a requirement. It's not legal, or it's not a legal mandate that you have to file a tax return every year. It's just something that we naturally always do, just because the government says that you should do it, which I agree you should, because usually when you file taxes, you end up getting money back anyway, but it's not a legal requirement. It's actually a voluntary system. But in that world, you don't really have much financial privacy to begin with. Now, my problem there is, if we have to assume that you can't have too much financial privacy, you have to assume that you have a benevolent government, something that truly is and always will look out for the interest and benefits of its people. Now, there are people in the United States right now that certainly don't think over the last 20 years certain administrations have had that interest. There's a lot of people that don't think the Biden administration does. The other half of the country didn't think the Trump administration did, and that goes on and on and on back probably until like pre-George Bush, and then everything was generally okay. Not great, but at least seemed, I don't know, my perspective seems it was a little bit more moderate, right? But there are many governments around the world that have historically proven that you cannot trust them with this financial information. Most notably, I would say, in modern history would be Germany. Just look at what happened with a certain group of people in Germany and their financial assets back in the 1930s and 1940s. And that's where I think this conversation gets tricky, because if we live in a world where we have to agree governments need to exist and have taxation, therefore there can't really be too much financial privacy, is that not potentially a net negative effect? Because you can see what a tyrannical government can potentially do to a population and weaponize that information.
Yeah, I think it's better to err on the side of giving individuals financial privacy, even if that means the government taxes less effectively, than to give the government complete knowledge of every transaction that occurs. So, I mean, what I imagine you'd see governments doing is requiring corporations that are going to incorporate to list all of their Bitcoin addresses or something like that. and maybe even list the Bitcoin addresses of their employees so the government can see how much is coming in, how much is going out.
Well, so that's how they passed through income tax, because initially in the Constitution it was illegal to levy a tax, but the government actually, it was kind of brilliant of them. They effectively said, okay, fine, if the federal government can't levy an income tax, what we will do is not grant business licenses to employers unless they withhold income tax to begin with. So that was like the first dam that broke. And then after that, amendments were made. It became constitutional for a federal income tax, et cetera, et cetera. But it's literally like what happened to fund the wars like 100 years ago is literally the exact same process that you're mentioning here. They'll go at it through the employers.
So that still keeps a certain level of privacy. Once the Bitcoin comes into the employee's account, then maybe they have to use some privacy tools to move it to another address that the government doesn't know about. But I think while it might make it slightly more difficult, again, it's a lot like cash, right? People get paid in cash all the time by businesses and they don't report. This happens with tips. This happens with a lot of manual labor jobs where people...
When I was a kid, I used to get so mad whenever I got a tip and somebody paid with a credit card. I always just wanted and granted, this was back in the early 2000s, I think, when I was a waiter. Holy God, it pissed me off when someone used a credit card because I had to declare the tip or the tax.
When I delivered pizzas, it was always cash because I didn't have any credit card stuff. So yeah, they just hand me $2-3, and after a night of that, I had a whole lot of cash. And then it was up to me, right, whether to do the legal, responsible thing of reporting it, whether to do the illegal, irresponsible, really dumb thing of reporting none of it. What most of my coworkers did was report some of it, but not very much. Just enough to be plausible in case they got audited. And I don't know why the government is spending resources to audit pizza deliverers, but maybe it happens. So yeah, I think that.
Well, you know, they got to audit the guy that got paid 10,000 Bitcoin for delivering pizzas, because if that guy kept that Bitcoin, he's doing really. It's actually ironic because we're talking about this. It's literally when we're recording right now, it is
yes,
Bitcoin
and you're going to Papa John's.
I always wanted to know what happened to that Bitcoin, right?
We hear a lot about the guy who paid for the Bitcoin, right, Laszlo? But we don't know what happened to the guy who accepted it. What a genius!
I mean, or maybe he just gave it to Papa John's, and Papa John's was willing to accept the 10,000 Bitcoin, and Papa John's has a stash of Bitcoin somewhere that they just don't know about, which means I should go buy Papa John's.
My suspicion is that they probably accepted it and then immediately converted it into cash.
Oh, yeah. He probably immediately went to local Bitcoins or something and sold it out for like the $30 of the pizza that was owed, I'm sure. But I would love to know who that pizza guy was, because I'm sure he's kicking himself the same way that the actual pizza.
Yeah, this is a call for Pete Rizzo to get on this story and tell the other side of the story, as only the best Bitcoin historian can do.
Yeah, exactly. No, so then, okay, so your view is that like the government, I mean, there has to be a little bit of transparency with the government, but like Bitcoin can operate as a pseudo form of physical cash, which still means that you have elements of financial privacy. Do you not see a risk of that being completely destroyed with the advent of a CBDC?
I see, so two things. One, I see potential for a more private CBDC because of the threat of Bitcoin. I think even prominent Bitcoin critics, Rohan Gray, for example, who's a law professor up in Oregon, is very anti-Bitcoin, but very pro-privacy. And he has been sounding the drum for years now about any future CBDC needs to be private, and it needs to be provably private. We be able to know exactly what's happening. And the other thing is, I think...
How do you prove it to be private, though? Because, for instance, this conversation we're having right now, I'm sure there's someone on the NSA that's listening in on the other side, right? So, like, how can we prove privacy in a world where we can't even prove that our telecommunications
maybe open source development of the CBDC, publish the code, prove via some checksum that the code that's being run on your computer that's holding your CBDC is the same that's published on the website, and you can look through the code, and you can have open source developers who understand code better than you do, telling you whether or not it's private. That's the best way I could think of, but I don't write code, so I'm not sure. But the other aspect is that while if the CBDC that is introduced is not private, then people will just use Bitcoin instead. And I'm sure people will figure out on-ramps and off-ramps from Bitcoin to the CBDC that are slightly more private or completely private, rather than using standard exchanges.
So my worry is that, I mean, those on and off ramps are already exposed to regulatory capture, right? We've already seen this happen. The on and off ramps are effectively becoming the ETFs now that they're approved, which, I mean, it's a great thing. A lot of people, like for me, there are some people that say the Bitcoin ETFs are a net negative because it's not the hold your keys, hold your Bitcoin sort of narrative. It's just exposure to Bitcoin. And there's even a lot of controversy around some of the things that they're able to do with the ETFs related to the Bitcoin holdings. It's not one-to-one backed the way that people think it is, but that's neither here nor there. But at the end of the day, it's really just a proxy for Bitcoin, right? Even the exchanges themselves. And it was inevitable that they would be subject to regulatory capture, but if you want to at least adhere to AML laws as they're constructed today, you can't avoid the regulatory capture of the on-off ramps, right? Now, what worries me is that we're then going to be in a world where it's going to be highly illegal, if not damn near impossible, to just transact in native Bitcoin. And I think governments are going to be very smart about this. They're going to say, download your CBDC wallet. And when you do, there is going to be 1,000 CBDC dollars in there waiting for you. And people, I mean, so individuals maybe like you and I who understand the fundamental values of financial privacy, that understand the workings of Bitcoin, why it has fundamental value, we'll still stick with Bitcoin, but we're still going to be forced to work in that CBDC world in a certain regard, the same way we're forced to work in the dollar world right now. But the mainstream, the masses that don't really care, don't even know that they should care about financial privacy and about Bitcoin, they're just going to accept their very happy 1,000 CBDC dollars that gets deposited on their phone, and they're going to go to Best Buy and get their new TV. You know, it's the same thing that happened with the helicopter bucks from Trump and Biden during COVID, right? That was the best year that's Best Buy ever had.
I mean, I'll probably download my CBDC wallet and go buy something with $1,000 and then try to use that wallet as little as possible going forward. I think the last 8 years have, and maybe beyond that too, have taught people a lot about how valuable their data is, especially their spending data. And there's constantly talk of identity theft and things in the news about corporations knowing more about your purchases. There's worries. Is your iPhone listening to you? Is that why you're getting ads on Facebook right after you say something out loud?
So I'm 100% convinced that they do. I'm 100% convinced that they do, because I was in my office one day with a coworker of mine, Max, and this was years ago. And just out of nowhere, he starts talking about this new protein shake called Huel, Huel. And him and I were just sitting there talking about it. He was saying it's really delicious, blah, blah, blah. Huel, sponsor the podcast next time.
Hold on.
No, but I swear to God, I had never heard of it before. I never Googled it. I never looked it up on Facebook or anything. I was bombarded across every social media platform that I have with Huel advertisements. Oh. God damn it, my podcast has even been invaded by Huel.
I knew you were going to say that. So.
No, but this is like, this is like 6 or 7 years ago. See, somebody was listening to my iPhone and said, hey, you should have this guy Brad on your podcast. This is all just a part of that bigger conspiracy of advertisements. You probably work for Facebook, don't you? No, but I swear to God, they do listen. I don't think all the time, but there is an element.
So, and like when I talk to my students here, I teach critical thinking, I teach intro to philosophy. I have dozens to hundreds of students every semester. And when I introduce myself at the beginning, I talk about my past work in metaphysics and philosophy of religion, and then I talk about my current work in Bitcoin. And a bunch of them ask me, either right then they'll raise their hand, or they'll stick around to ask afterwards, why do you care about Bitcoin? What do you think about Bitcoin? And when I try to explain things like the 21 million supply cap and fiat currencies and stuff, their eyes glaze over. They don't get it at all. When I talk about financial privacy, immediately they understand. Half of the student, I don't know exact percentages. Some of the students, you say, well, what if you wanted to buy a gun? Would you want the Biden administration to know that you bought a gun? The other percentage of students, you say, what if you or someone you love needed to have an abortion or get gender-affirming surgery or medical care? Would you want the Trump administration to know about that? And they immediately understand that any way that they try to pay for these things, the government is going to find out and perhaps punish them. And they know that.
See, and that's the point. And I don't think people understand that both sides will bastardize this in a way that's negative for the collective. It's negative.
So they immediately get it on their side. And then I say, what if you had different beliefs and you wanted gender affirming care or guns or something? Can you see how it's just better if we have privacy by default, and that you have to actually do something criminal in order to surrender your right to that financial privacy? And the student, they grew up online at this point, so they get it immediately.
Right.
They've never lived without and some of them are just totally surrendered to it. Like they live stream their whole lives, and that's fine with them, and they don't care. But even they think, yes, I might right now I like that I can selectively show people my life. And there are parts of my life that I don't want them to see. And there are things that I buy that I wouldn't want people to know about. And it's fine when it's some faceless corporation that doesn't know me individually. So I'll buy, condoms with a Visa card or something. But it would be better if I didn't have to. And if there were an option that were easy enough, then I would do that. So I think the big challenge that we lay down at the end of the privacy chapter is that Bitcoin developers and people who are interested in Bitcoin need to work more on privacy tools.
So let me ask you this then. What do you think is the best outcome in this scenario to protect personal financial privacy? And what is this will be our final question just in the interest of time. So what is the best outcome for what that financial world looks like, whether it be Bitcoin, CBDC dollars, and what keeps you up at night that could be the death of any and all financial privacy?
I think the best outcome is for things to continue roughly as they are, which is with a lot of competition. Government-backed currencies, non-government-backed currencies like Bitcoin that have rules, non-government-backed cryptocurrencies that have rulers who can change the rules. I'm sure at some point in the not too distant future, we're going to get AI governed cryptocurrencies where the monetary policies are going to change radically and drastically at the whims of AI that, some people will trust to have their best interest. And so you'll have a choice about which of these things to hold, and maybe you hold some of each of them, or maybe you believe in one more than the other. But there's a wide variety of choice that people can pick. And I want all of those to be accessible to everyone. The nightmare scenario, I guess, is government and or corporate crackdowns on some of these, especially the ones that are most inclusive and most outside of the control of governments and authoritarians. So when I talk to US policymakers about Bitcoin, I talk to them about how people are using it in other countries to resist authoritarians. And some of them say, oh yeah, no, that's great. I love that. But our government is good. And so I don't want people to be able to resist our government. And I think, no, that's not how it works. Yeah. You have to do it theoretically.
But it's not even our government is good. It's if you identify with the current administration, right? It's like, oh yeah, I like this administration, but no, I don't like that one. People are fickle in that regard, I suppose. No, but So I actually take that a little bit further. My nightmare scenario is we're going to have a CBDC that looks like something out of a Black Mirror episode where it's issued through an employer on behalf of the government, automatically taxed. You have to go through hoops and you have to jump through hurdles to get maybe certain elements of that back. It's automatically deducted any taxation through a VAT tax. I actually think a CBDC will implement a VAT tax in America through any transaction that occurs. And worse off, I worry that you're going to lose all financial privacy. I mean, now you even have to report any transaction that's over $600 to the IRS, which is just absolutely absurd. And B, we're going to live in a world where to increase the velocity of money, therefore the theoretical demand of the dollar, you're not going to be permitted to save in the CBDC, that there will be an expiry date on that CBDC that you have to use it at a certain point, which effectively means that you're completely destroying not only financial privacy, but you're destroying property rights. That's what keeps me up at night. And that's where CBDCs absolutely horrify me. I'd love a world where it's open source, like you said. And I think maybe we can get there, and it's becoming a lot more of a political conversation. And hopefully that's what comes to fruition. But I'm just horrified at some of the conversations that you see mainstream politicians having around what a CBDC can be, particularly in Europe. The way the ECB is going, absolutely horrified.
Yeah, I guess I'm less worried about that because I'm more confident that the current generation of cypherpunks will figure out a way to get from a CBDC to Bitcoin without sort of governmental problems. So either without the government finding out or without the government confiscating the CBDC or something. I mean, if you have to spend it and you can't invest it, then the stock market is gone and a whole bunch of financial infrastructure goes out the window. So it might be approved.
Or instead of saving the dollar, you have to invest it. So it's not just you have to, you either have to spend it or you have to invest it. And then it becomes a tool to artificially inflate an economy because for some reason, especially during political season, the only thing that people care about is the stock market going up. And it's really funny because for decades, that's how every politician has said, oh, look how great my economic policy has been. We've never had, the stock market has gone up. That changed in this election cycle, I think. Nobody cares much about that anymore. It's all about inflation.
So you might have a range of approved CBDC addresses that you can send your CBDC to, which are merchants and various stock offerings or whatever.
Well, so this is where it gets even more interesting. I mean, did you see it was the former president of the Bank of England? He said that we can make this money programmable, where for employers to actually pay out I guess they call it the quid there, for employers to pay out the pounds, they will be able to program what the employees are permitted to buy. Like, that's just fucking horrifying. So I didn't even touch on that part, but I mean, that's a part of my nightmare scenario.
Yeah. So this is ceases to be an erosion of privacy and is more a censorship issue, which is you are not allowed to take your money and spend it on things that we don't want you to spend it on. And you can think of good reasons for that, right? If you know one of your employees is an alcoholic and also has a kid that needs to go to daycare, you might say, before you spend any money on alcohol, you need to spend this money on the daycare for your kids. And there's like a prima facie good case to be made for that. On the other hand, exactly.
But that's how these policies always work. Like, there's always a good idea behind why certain policies like that should exist. Like, or for instance, like, let's say you live in a country that has guns banned. Well, okay, you're going to program the currency that you can't buy guns, right? Well, and on the flip side, let's say you live in a country where they ban what you call gender affirming care. They ban the ability for gay people to go pay at the courthouse to get married, right? Well, what are those people going to do? And that's where I kind of always default back to the idea that money just should not be programmed, even though at the base intention, it's good. It always comes back to, well, but who's in charge? who, what is the governance overseeing that, and can it be changed? Can it be fickle and subject to the whims of whatever's politically favorable at that point in time? And can you always trust whoever that political individual is to be benevolent and logical and rational in how they apply it? And I just don't think
history has shown us that you can't. So regardless of what the reasoning seems to be at the time, the fact is that you're giving control to not a certain person or group of people, but the holders of certain roles. And you never know who's going to be in that role next and how they might use that role to exert slightly more control to enact their authoritarian tendencies.
Nothing is more permanent than a temporary government solution, right? Now, Brad, I absolutely enjoyed this conversation. We're going to have you back on at some point in the future, because I didn't know that you were formerly a professor of religious philosophy, because the only course I've ever failed in my entire life was a world religions course I took at the University of Delaware. Still pains me that I got that F. But that will make for a very fun conversation at some point in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about that.
Yeah.
So Resistance Money is being published June 14th. And it's a global, neutral, philosophical case for Bitcoin, going from this veil of ignorance to the idea that everyone should prefer a world with Bitcoin. And so we ought to work to make Bitcoin stick around so that people have access to it. So you can buy it on Amazon or on Rutledge if you're international. I think, not sure the prices got updated on Amazon internationally, but you can buy directly from Rutledge for free shipping. And let me know what you think.
I'm going to make sure that I go put my pre-order in on Amazon right now. It'll be waiting for me the next time I'm back in the States.
Nice. Thanks.
It was an absolute pleasure, Brad. I hope you have a great one.
Likewise. You too.